Hi guys, I'm Matthew, your VB Tutor. Welcome back to this short series, episode 2, where I'm going to take you through creating your database, executing queries, executing scalars, creating tables within your database, and checking if tables exist. If you haven't already checked out episode 1, where I go through the initialize method and the logging method, then check that out first. So next, we're going to start looking at how to create a database. So our database is essentially just going to be a single file that we can place on our local system, on a shared drive, on Dropbox or Google Drive or something like that, any other sort of shared service that we can have multiple users interact with. This allows us to actually have multiple people interacting with the same data, so multiple people can run your application and operate seamlessly together. So now we're going to get into how to create the database. So we've got a public sub. This is going to be public because we're actually going to be calling this from outside our class. So we're going to create the database, and I want to have the database path being passed to this. This is going to be the path of the actual file, and we're going to also have a password. So we can set a password when we create the database. You can have certain double checks and things like that when you call this method from outside, but that's entirely up to you. At the start of every method, you'll see me do this. We've got our error handler, so I'm just going to copy that in here. And what we want to have in this error handler is going to be a log method. So we're going to call our log message method. This is the one just down here. And we're going to say there was an error in create database, because this is the method that we're working in. And we'll just say what that error was. And then we'll also raise that error just so that the user is aware that there's a problem. Database manager dot create database. This can be whatever you like. It's just, this is how I like to create these errors. So failed to create database. Description. Okay, so this is going to be a general structure that you see for just about every method that we make. We're going to need to check that the database doesn't already exist, because if it already exists, then essentially we just don't need to create it. So we're going to do another dir check. This is the same as what we did up here for the log folder, but this time we're going to be checking for an actual file. So we're going to do database path, because the database path has been passed to us here, and then we just make sure that that does not equal nothing. If it does not equal nothing, then we can just log that message and say database already exists at database path. And then we can exit the sub from there. So we don't need to go any further. It's already, the database already exists. So now we're going to have a category object. I'm just going to call it dim_cat as object. And then we're going to set cat to create object. And this is why we needed the ADO or the Active Directory library. So catalog, just make sure you get this spelling correct here for the ADOX catalog. So then we're going to do a connection string. So our connection string is going to be a very specific string of text. So I'll put this down in the video description for you if that makes it a bit easier. So we're going to have provider equals Microsoft ACE OLEDB 12.0, and then the data source, we're going to adjoin this, our database path. To add the password to this, we're going to have get OLEDB database password equals DB password. So then we use our catalog object and we go catalog.create and we just pass that connection string to that. If something happens there, if an error occurs there, it's going to jump down directly to our error handler. So if it passes this, we can assume that everything's gone well, the database has been created. So we're going to log the message to say database created at database path. Database path. Then we just want to release our category object so we don't have any residual objects, and that's it. So this is going to be our routine to create a database. Now what we can do is I'm going to create a simple module. First thing we're going to want to do is define what our database path is and our database password is. So these can be public or private. It depends on how you're going to be using this module, but we're going to for now create these as constants. So we're going to set these to a public constant. I'm going to call this database path as a string, and then I'm going to put this in my database tutorials path, and we're going to call this just tutorial database dot. Now your file extension can be essentially whatever you like. If you're familiar with these type of objects, then you're aware that something like an access database file would be a popular kind of choice. But if you want to sort of brand your files a bit better, do things your own way, then absolutely. I'm going to call this an XLDB, so Excel database. This is something that I use for a lot of my applications. So my system already recognizes that as something that I can open in Microsoft Access. That being said, you do not need to have Microsoft Access installed to make this work, neither do the people that you're sending this to. It's just a way that you can actually open the database and have a look at what's happening. So then we're going to have another constant for our password, the string, and we're just going to keep it simple. I'm just going to make the password 123. Makes it easy for us to open up the database when it's complete. Now we're just going to create a simple sub for create the database. First we're going to make an object. This is going to be our object of our class. So we're going to just call this a DB object as class database. Oops, class database. I'm going to set that object to a new instance of that. You can also just, if you like, rather than having these two lines of code, you can just put new here. That will instantiate the object as a new object. So then we're going to basically just try and create this database file, and let's see if that works. So DB object, create database. Then we're just going to pass in our DB path and DB password. So if I run this, everything went well. Now, two things that we can look at here. So we have our VBA logs in our app data. We can have a look at this file if you like. So in here you can just see database created at this location, and if we go to that location we can see our Excel database file. Now as I said, you can open this up to have a look at it. You'll need to open it in something like Microsoft Access. So if you don't already have the file type recognized by Microsoft Access, you'll just need to open with. Open with will probably be up the top here, and then you can select access there. If you don't see it in this list, you'll just have to go and browse for it. So let's just open Microsoft Access. So you'll notice we've got a password. So this is the password that we created when we created our database file. We're just going to put in 123. That's going to give us access to the database. Now you'll notice we don't have anything here. Our database doesn't have any tables. So how do we create those? Theoretically, you could just create these tables in here, just add a table, do the steps, but we want to do things a bit more programmatically, because if we're distributing this application, this Excel application, to other people, then we need to be able to dynamically create these tables and the database object, of course. So we'll go back to our database class, and we're going to start actually creating these tables. So first, we're going to build a function to check if a table already exists. Because again, we want to build things and make sure that they're not already existing, to ensure that we're not doubling up on anything or creating issues. Create a private function, because we only need to check this as we're creating the tables. So we only need to do this sort of from within the class. So we're going to do a table exists function, and we're just going to pass in a table name. And then we want that to result in a Boolean value, so a true or false value. Then we're going to do our error handling. Go to error handler. What do we want to log? So in here, we'll probably just log something like error in table exists, and just say what the error description is. And then we'll probably want to say that the table exists is likely going to be false if there's an error here, because if something's gone wrong, then it's obviously, not able to see that that table is where it's supposed to be. So now we're going to need an object here. So we're going to I'm just going to call this object. I'm going to set the object equal to our connection. So our connection, while we haven't actually set a connection at the moment, we'll go through that in a little while, as con in our variables within the class. So then we're going to open schema. Now this can get a little bit confusing. If you want me to go into a bit more details, just leave some comments down below. So we'll add schema tables array empty table name, and then we're checking that it's a table object. So this will return an object. Obviously we've got our object here, so we just want to check if that's object.eof, and then if it's EOF, that means that it's actually found something. So we're going to return table exists equals true, else table exists equals false, and then we're just going to close that object. And again, we release objects, make sure that we don't have any residual things hanging around. And then after that, we just exit our function, and now we can actually use this function to check if a table exists within our database. Now we're going to build the routine for our create table. So to this, we want to pass in a table name. And then this one's going to get a little bit complex, but I'll explain this a little bit more later on. So this is going to be our fields. It's a variant. Oops, create table. Okay, so again, error handling, go to error handler, error description. Okay, so standard looking kind of error that we're raising there. Okay, so we're going to need an SQL command. So SQL is another programming language, another language that's used to interact with databases. If you're not too familiar with SQL, the basics are very easy to learn, but I'll go through some of the very standard commands that we're going to use here. So we'll do a create, SQL create string, and two other things we're going to want is a field and a field definition. Field definition. Okay, so first we want to check if the table exists. Again, we've just created that method, but we're going to need to check if that table already exists. So check if table exists and just pass in the table name. Obviously, if the table already exists, we don't need to recreate it. Name. And then we're going to exit the routine because we don't need to go any further if the table already exists. So now we're going to start the create table SQL. So this is just going to be the start of the SQL command. I'll sort of go through what we're doing as we sort of build this out. So SQL create table, we pass in the table name, and then we just open the brackets that we need for that. So as a bit of an example of what an SQL table creation command or query is going to look like, I'll just put this here so you can have a bit of a look at that. So essentially we've just got create table. The bookings is going to be the name of the table, and then we're going to have these are your different fields. So we've got booking ID as an auto increment field. This is going to be your ID number that increments as you create more records in your database. Customer ID, which we're going to have referenced from our customer table, vehicle ID from our vehicle table, start date and end date, and just setting up these variables as you go and determining what types of variables they are, or what types of fields they are, I should say. So essentially what we're going to do then is we're going to have to iterate over the fields. So this is the fields array to build the definitions. So to essentially just build out this query here. So for each field, in fields, I'm just going to close it off. So essentially what we're going to be doing is passing the fields into this in sort of separate arrays. So first we're going to check, is it an array, that each field? So each field should have the field name, the field type, and if it's something like a text, the field length. You can get more complex with this, but this is just the basics and it does most of what we need to do. So if it's not an array, then something's sort of gone wrong there. So we're just going to raise an error to say, go VB object error +2 create table. So again, create table is where the issue happened. Field definition must be an array. So that's our problem. All right. So as I said, we're going to have 3 separate items in each array. Each array is going to have the field name, the field type, and if it requires a length to be set, then it's going to be a third variable. So we're going to do if upper bound of the field is greater than or equal to 1, then our field definition, this is going to be essentially this part here, equals first, because it's a 0 indexed array, the first item in the array, and then the second item in the array. So we're passing in, say, booking ID here. It's creating the square brackets around that, and then we're passing in auto increment as the type, and it's passing that in. So if our field also is also greater than that, so if it's larger than that, then that means that we've passed in a size as well. So the way we just need to handle that, definition equals field definition, and you just want to put in a bracket, field 2. So our third variable that we're passing to it, again 0 indexed array, is going to be the length. So that just needs to be in brackets after the type. So if this was, say, text, then we do text length 50, like that. All right, and then our SQL create, we're going to append that. So SQL create, and we just add in our field definition, and we'll put in a comma because we need a comma between each field definition. Okay, now what if we're passing in something that doesn't have a field name, field type, field size like that? Then we're going to need to say if the array is the wrong size, and we want to raise an error as well. So we're going to do VB object error +1 this time. Create table invalid field definition. Okay, so again, just going over this, we're going to say that we assume each field is passed as an array, and this would look like field name, field type, and then an optional field size. So this is how our array is going to look as we pass it in. Oh, sorry, it'll be more like array, like that. So finally, when we get to the end, we're going to have this sort of trailing little comma. So we just want to clean that up. So going to go left, SQL create, we get the length of our SQL command, and take 2 off because we've got 1, 2 characters there. Close that off, and we close the bracket for the command. So that's just our end bracket sitting there at the end of the command. And then this is going to be a method that we look at in the next lesson. This is going to be our execute query. So execute query, SQL create. And then again, if everything went well there, then we can safely assume that the process was successful. So we'll just say log message, table name, the table created successfully, and we'll just give the the SQL command so that can be in the log as well. Just helps with auditing and things like that. So that'll do for this episode. In the next episode, we'll go over the execute query and probably an execute scalar, and I'll explain what that is if you're not aware. So thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next one.